All right, so our topic today is right size, right performance, right time, which it's a lot. But basically, many engineers have also had to work with software riddled with so much technical debt and inefficiency that organization is practically impossible and a complete rewrite is required. So when is the right time? So in this panel, we'll talk about two engineering leaders and architects about their approach to software optimization, when to do it, and how to design systems that scale and stay performant. Before I start, I'm just going to quickly introduce our panel members. So we've got James Bell. James is a principal software engineer at Samsung Smartthings. We've also got Benjamin Vulpes, a director of mobile engineering at Seaworld, and Saba El-Hilo, a senior VP of engineering at Unbounce. Thank you, folks. All right, so I guess we can get the ball started, but one of the big questions that I've got in terms of approaches is when you're starting to scale things, like how do you start taking something that might be a big problem and whittling it down so that you can actually deal with smaller pieces of the projects as you go along. So I guess the first assumption is that you're recognizing that you need to do something to fix the problem. The next is your approach. So how do you actually start tackling the problem? Maybe I gave away something that I do, which is try to make things smaller, but what are some other tactics that you might use when trying to solve these problems at scale?
I think for me, the first thing is trying to find what the exit criteria is. Oftentimes in performance tuning, what you end up doing is slowly working your way down into smaller and smaller units of work or smaller and smaller optimizations. You can end up in a place to where you're actually wasting the company's time and money working on something that no longer is improving the state of the application. And so understanding that exit criteria helps inform what you're going to be doing in the process of tuning.
That makes sense. What about yourself, Benjamin?
Riff a little bit on that. It's also important to coach other people to avoid that too.
Yeah.
Like, to help them understand when they're into marginal returns. Because it's, it can be very exciting as an engineer to get in there and find all of the places where you can speed things up. But at a certain point, at least in our case, for example, getting much below 400 millis on P95 isn't going to give us much, because the data that we need to get into the parks where our guests are, those pipes are already full. So the speed up isn't really worth, the juice isn't worth the squeeze, so to speak.
Right.
I try to articulate the problem, and I try actually get other people to articulate the problem first, because then they buy into the process of building a solution far more effectively than if I had just taken a step back and put my head down for a couple of days and analyzed it and wrote the design docs myself and then showed up. Then people are like, oh, okay, fine, I guess we'll go build something that Ben designed. It's much better for the engineering team to come up with those designs themselves.
Fair enough. And for both of you, I guess, is there a break glass point where you say, hey, we need to stop and reevaluate kind of thing before we move forward? And how do you sort of gauge where that would be?
Most of our performance exercises at Samsung end up being evaluated on a weekly cycle.
Okay.
Just because that's how our work planning program works. And so oftentimes when we're dealing with either a performance regression or sort of a new feature that has some sort of strict performance requirement, always sort of checking in with who the PM is or the support team and saying, what does it feel like? We might have an exit criteria of it needs to be down to 500 milliseconds. But oftentimes what we'll see is that was an arbitrary number based on some historical understanding of what performance needed to look like, and the actual user experience might be something that 650 is okay for this use case, and I think we're good to move on.
Fair enough. And I guess that would be the same thing for you. What sort of goals would you have in mind when starting to tackle one of these problems where it does involve a large possible software organization, or maybe going through your engineering, or you're trying to figure out who to assign to the team and where to start first?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Ben mentioned this already. It's a lot about the data and the metrics that you're taking a look at. So being really clear on what it is you're trying to optimize. Is it latency? Is it cost? Is it scalability? You can't tackle all of those things at once. So being very clear about what it is that you're trying to solve for, and being clear on this is the amount of effort that this is going to take, and these are the gains or the wins that we're going to get out of it, and kind of making the decision with the teams from there.
Gotcha. So when you kick off a project like this, do you try to define those goals at the start, basically?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Back there, where you stop and kind of figure out what might need to be added to the goals or possibly removed from the goals, or maybe new incentives that come in? What does that look like?
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of like incremental updates, right?
Okay.
So every huge migration project or rewrite or improvement to an existing system, we really take a phased approach. So you define those phases as part of the discovery. And at each phase, whenever it's delivered, you take a look at like what it is that you've achieved. Did you hit the goal that you started with or not? Are the metrics moving in the right direction? Do you need to course correct? So having those phases and treating an engineering project like kind of like a product project as well, with phases and releases really helps in like making sure those checkpoints are there, and you're having a discussion with the team of like, okay, we refactored this service. Is it worth continuing or evaluating? Yeah.
I like that. So one of the things I'm hearing is kind of that shorter cycle that you're talking about, but the other that I'm hearing is those longer phases, which also sounds pretty cool. So Benjamin, on your side, what would those look like? So a week sounds pretty fast to me. A phase, I would assume, is it like months or a month, that kind of thing?
I think it depends.
It depends? Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
What about yourself? And I realize that these aren't hard and fast. I think it depends is always a good answer.
Very project dependent, I think. I mean, it's the easy engineering answer, right? It depends. But for one particular project where we were replacing one HTML, JS implementation with another, we hit our performance numbers on the rewrite like very quickly. And so there was a lot of time that the engineers could have kept running on that, but I see it as the responsibility of tech leadership to intervene and say like, okay, great, you hit your goals early. This is a rare moment. Go cannibalize that time for accelerating the rest of the timeline. But then there have been other projects. We rewrote an F# implementation of our API into C#
Right.
for sociocultural reasons.
Always fun.
Yeah, and that took a while, right? It does. We were very lucky in that it was a very simple system and like well documented and so on. So the rewrite itself went very well, and then we had good rollout hygiene and good observability so that we had the ability to run it in production with 1% of traffic. And product just had to accept that we were going to have failures while we did this. And then, once we saw all of the errors that we were going to see at 1% of traffic, ramp to 5% of traffic, and do that for a week and a half.
Gotcha. Yeah, I like that ramping in from 1% to 5%, something that's statistically significant prior to actually rolling out. The other thing that you're mentioning in there is in terms of like deploying something like F# and a C# org can always be fun, having done that myself. Is there anything that you have to plan for in terms of maybe training other engineers for new language? Because F#'s a different piece.
Yeah, I wouldn't do it again.
Okay, fair enough, fair enough.
I wouldn't do it again. I mean, C# engineers, like they like the warm embrace of C#, and it's totally reasonable. It's a totally adequate type system. It's a totally adequate everything. And F# has some sharp edges.
Yes. At Smartthings, we are primarily a Java shop. And over time, as we start to look towards edge compute and sort of moving centralized cloud services as close to the user as possible for reliability as well as performance reasons, we've started our adoption of Rust. And one of the big things in regards to performance that we started to do is popularize that performance testing is not something that's done point in time or done as a part of sort of production metrics. It's also a part of the CI pipeline. You don't necessarily need a load test environment all of the time, but you can generate relative load in a CI environment to inform the performance of your application and drive better results that you hopefully have less of these large, traumatic, and disruptive events where you have to stop your product development lifecycle and move into triage doing performance tuning.
Gotcha. So it sounds like that spider graph is like another axis on it for that performance. Is that something like a quick smoke test? Like you're just trying to go through a certain amount of data to see if your performance increased or decreased over time? Roughly?
We do some smoke testing. It's obviously hard with our data model since we have so many integrators, but it's also, starts at pull request time of running, your unit tests, your integration tests, and then also performance tests in a somewhat functional style. Oftentimes, organizations have problems with load testing because of the cost of this non-production environment that's just getting beaten up all day. And so sort of right-sizing what your load needs to look like for what your application's running in can yield some really positive results.
Am I inferring that you run like scaled down load tests and
Correct.
collect metrics over time? So you're not like full scale load tests,
Right.
but you just want to see the representative behavior over time.
Right. Obviously, nothing matches production for us at our scale, but we can we can at least infer that, you know, oh, you just added an unsigned or an unsigned map to this collection. You're going to be allocating memory on the fly. We're going to see performance problems and regressions with that. Is there a way for you to strongly type what that's going to look like?
I like that. So that I'm assuming some of this involves like the PR that kicks off the CI/CD and then it comes back, that kind of thing. I guess what worries me sometimes when you're doing performance testing like that while trying to deploy is that like a little bit of the approval process kind of thing. Does that gum up the works, or what does that look like when you're adding so many things that you're testing at the same time?
Not necessarily. These are tests that don't necessarily have a failure criteria. It's more of informing the reviewer, what does this look like? And obviously this is something that's not totally proliferated across all of our systems. It's sort of mission critical systems first, and then as adoption can continue throughout the organization. But those mission critical systems, those are sort of our most experienced developers looking for signals, not necessarily gates. We want guardrails, not gates.
That's totally fair. Yeah, I guess as someone who likes to pull up a 6-shooter once in a while and go a little bit cowboy, maybe in staging, not on prod, I think the pull request procedure is one of those things where when it's like a really big project and you have to refactor and it needs to be done quickly, sometimes I guess myself, I can be guilty of not following all the process, which is why I asked. But Saba, what does that look like for you when it comes to having like a team or a virtual team that's working on one of these refactoring projects? What does that process look like in the PR sort of workflow with your CI/CD? Is it still the same, like same old, or do you adopt something a little bit different to help you go a little bit faster?
Yeah, honestly, it's the same. I think the only difference is like you're running things in parallel, right? So when you're doing deployments, you could be deploying to two different systems and seeing the effects on them, and then running things in parallel for a while to make sure your performance is where it is and within expectations. So I think really that's the biggest difference. But in terms of the day-to-day process and deployment, like it's pretty much the same, yeah.
Gotcha. So if I understand it correctly, you might have a collection of microservices, and if you're working on one, it's almost like you could have a clone, like the alpha, beta, gamma kind of thing that's coming on in the stack, and you'll eventually move over to that as you're going.
Yeah.
And because of that, you can follow the same process that you follow for the rest.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
And again, like this is why I'm not in engineering any longer, because I do feel like sometimes you want to go fast. Basically, you're like Sonic the Hedgehog. You get in there. Maybe I'll YOLO this pull request into staging and test the performance on something a little bit larger. Where I think your approach, James, is a little bit nicer when you're doing it on a smaller scale and sort of extrapolating what that performance might look like in prod.
Right, and we definitely do have non-production environments where we try to put some load through to do that testing, but generally speaking, we also are a very lean organization, so we do like to move very fast.
Right.
We don't have any sort of load test that would fail a pull request, but for someone like myself as a principal engineer or a senior staff looking at a pull request, if we see that cyclomatic complexity jumped, or if code coverage went down, or if the performance of the application is going to be negatively impacted, that's where we start doing review comments, because we don't necessarily want to become the legacy enterprise that has a babillion checks that blocks your progress, but we also don't want to be the organization that flies blind.
What's an acceptable runtime for the collection of blocking tests?
Generally, our pull request lifecycle for like checks runs within 30 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah. It really depends on the service and how complex those tests are, how many they have. But generally speaking, if you can go get lunch, it's probably running too long.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I like that. So more of a coffee kind of thing.
Yeah.
Now, so Saba, one of the things that I used to try to do is boil the ocean and try to do integration tests as opposed to just doing little tests here and there. What does that test process look like in your CI/CD pipeline? Are you doing just a sort of the basic unit test, maybe some smoke tests? Is it soup to nuts, like end-to-end testing?
We have everything,
Everything,
really.
okay.
Yeah. So as a developer, you're writing unit tests with your code for sure, and then we have integration tests that cover the entire application. It's a web application, so really got to have a comprehensive test suite end to end, and that runs depending on some of the tests, some of them run every few hours, some of them run nightly, and then the unit tests run on every, whenever you commit your PR and deploy it. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I feel like we're also talking about different aspects of the software stack too. So James, I'm assuming a lot of this is back-end. Benjamin, I'm assuming some of this involves mobile front-end and back-end.
Yeah, it's all over for us.
Yeah, fair enough. And Saba, I'm assuming some of yours is like transactional emails, that kind of stuff, as well as mostly front-end and some databases on the back-end.
Yeah.
So the approach might change a little bit depending on what stack you're dealing with.
Totally.
So I'm sure there's some overlap in there as well. Excellent. Are there any like pieces of advice, Benjamin, that you'd have that you'd give to somebody if they're if they were trying to bite off something that's a little bit too big to chew, but they know they need to fix something? Is there that one thing that they should know before getting started?
In terms of like big projects in an org, or like an individual engineer biting off too much for the individual?
Oh, I guess both of those are good. I'll go for the first one though. So you're about to start a big project. You know you got to assemble a team or people that can work with it on you. What's your first step? So I think, Saba, you were talking about like writing down the goals, for example. For me, I like to think of it like incentives, and I think you said outcomes as well are kind of some of the things that I would normally push for in terms of like setting up that scaffolding.
Get all of those stakeholders on board. That's
Okay.
honestly, for me, that's an incredibly important part of doing big engineering work. I have a very small team, and like a good 90% of the time, we are working on what product wants us to work on. The deal with product, though, is that anybody on the engineering team can pull the and-on cord, to borrow a term from Toyota, and stop the production line and fix an issue in how we do what we do. In the absence of that, like if you decide that you do need to slow down on delivery for like a significant chunk of time to do something that's more serious, it takes a little bit more of like the nemawashi, where you run around behind closed doors and you're like, hey, I know this is going to be disappointing, but we really need to take a break on like customer-facing features for a while, because like I need the engineering team to focus on these things in this way. Right. It's going to be good for you because of X, Y, and Z. So that's, organizational politics scaling.
Gotcha. You sort of stumbled into like a second part of that question, but I love the Toyota way. I think the other one would be the Kaizen sort of thing. So if you are an engineer who needs to evolve but realizes that they're trying to do something that perhaps is a little bit larger than they should have taken on in the first place, what would that advice look like? Like how would they continuously change to adapt to these kinds of strategies or situations, I suppose?
I mean, both happen.
Right.
You find yourself in these local minima or maxima with Kaizen, and you're like, well, I've squeezed all of the compilation performance I can out of this particular structure, and to get to the next level, I actually need to like redo how all of the Gradle targets are set up, for example, just something out of the backlog. And I think coaching people to pick the right size task for the right size improvement is important, and helping them understand like when they are going to bite off a piece of Kaizen work that is going to slow the team down. And to like, instead of doing the politicking yourself as the technology leader, get the rest of the engineers bought into doing it as well.
Gotcha.
I think from my perspective, Smartthings started as a startup. We're now part of Samsung,
Right.
a gigantic organization.
Big difference in culture there, yeah.
Yes, yeah, and it's very easy in the corporate world to say, this is a big project, I need 3 months, you'll see something in 3 months.
Right.
And one of the things I really enjoy about Smartthings is that we still have that startup mentality, and one of the things that translates no matter where you are when you have a big project, especially in performance, is start and iterate. If you can deliver, if you're trying to shave 600 milliseconds off a request and you can get to your first 10 milliseconds, you're on your journey. You've made progress, you have a branch, keep moving forward, keep demonstrating progress. The longer you are out of production, the more risk you have the next time you get to production. And so move fast, iterate, and as Ben put, make sure that people are on board with what's moving.
Right. Right. And Saba, on your own, what would buy-in look like? So for me, that when people mention buy-in and trying to convince upper management, I used to work at Samsung as well and worked with Smartthings, and I do realize that sometimes it can be difficult to convince upper management to understand that this is important. So maybe we're moving from PHP to React, perhaps, something like that I've gone through before. We talked about C and C#. I've seen Java. I've also seen people try to like bring in Scala into the house because it's super fun. What does that look like on your end for buy-in? What are the tactics that people should use when they're trying to achieve that stakeholder buy-in?
Yeah, I mean, I think as developers, we're always like, we want to rewrite things, right?
Of course.
That's everyone's favorite thing. Like, you know, is it a greenfield project, or am I going to jump into like a project that's 10 years old?
A brownfield project.
Yeah. So don't say that. you
Fair
know,
enough.
Don't be like, hey, I want to learn Scala, so we should rewrite everything in Scala,
Which I've heard before, actually.
I've been part of.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, and I think it goes back to like our, you know, first conversation, which was about data and metrics.
Right.
Like, explain to everyone what it is that you're going to be, what the business is going to be gaining out of this. Because if you think about it from the lens of the business, like the investment is not insignificant. Like if you have a small team and you're like, we need to rewrite everything, you're not going to be able to deliver any new features for that time being, and you're basically just throwing out years of investment. Right. So it's a hard sell. And from my experience, when I've pitched projects like that, or have had projects pitched to me, like the ones that get approved are the ones that are very clear on what it is that you're gaining.
Gotcha.
And it is a business advantage, right?
Yeah.
So examples of that could be reducing costs or ensuring scalability, less outages, you know, improving latency, ensuring that you're going to be able to deliver more features in the future. So, for example, like with M&As, right? You want to integrate a new product into your stack, so making sure that you're all on the same platform so that you can actually iterate quickly and start shipping features in the future, right? So it's really like aspects like that, and like being able to speak that language and pitch it that way goes a long way.
Right, so it sounds like almost like a business case method is what you want. And some of it's like efficiency or risk, and you sort of talk about like maybe things could be better down the road or could be less worse now.
Well, I think that's one of the least glorious parts of performance enhancement is being the mature sort of business owner as an engineer, thinking about what am I doing for the organization, how am I improving it, and doing the spreadsheet and Google Doc work of what performance engineering looks like. It's not, you know, there is a small portion of performance engineering that ends up being sort of the hardcore software, and a lot of it ends up being trying to explain why something's happening, how you're going to approach it, and how you're going to move it forward. And that's what makes someone really, really good at performance engineering, in my opinion, is not just being able to figure out, you know, why the computer went beep when it was supposed to go bop, but also trying to get the business to understand how to invest in that.
Right.
It's important to work to scale that maturity of software development,
Absolutely.
that attitude. I had a very proud moment with a couple of my engineers recently where we were working through a very complicated feature together. And the complexity of it's super complicated, shared login between our apps and like the company website for e-commerce reasons. And it's going to be obviated in the next 6-9 months by some other feature work we're doing. Both of these engineers started out the conversation like, this is dumb, this is complicated, I hate this, why are we doing it? And then with just like a little bit of prodding and asking the right questions, they came around to, oh yeah, well, I guess like nothing is certain in delivery timelines. We don't know when we're gonna actually get these features in, and like, man, I really hate it, but I think that for the business, we really gotta do this one. And I was just so proud of them.
Oh.
So you're taking their why and trying to turn it into what, how?
Yeah.
But if we had to, what would that look like?
Not even like if we had to, just like letting them work through the like, well, hang on, why does Ben want us to do this? Why is this even in the backlog? Why has it been on someone's plate for months at this point, slowly getting ground on? And once they worked through all of the whys and the wherefores and what data it would get other teams involved, like the picture became clear.
And I think that's the difference, in my opinion, between a software developer and a software engineer, is that business context and understanding, because that's when you make the best decisions for the business and you write the most, I guess, functional software for what the problem actually is. And in performance engineering, oftentimes the answer to your largest performance increases, especially in distributed systems, don't necessarily come from code, they come from how that code's being utilized.
Gotcha. Now, you mentioned something that I think a lot of software engineers might not realize, that at some point in time you code a little bit less and less over time, and then you end up, it's like, oh no, I'm spending my whole day in Excel or my whole day in Google Docs, and I'm putting up PDFs that people need to sign to make sure that like someone's approved something. You're doing vendor management and things like that. Do you feel, Saba, that sometimes you just want to get your hands dirty and get back into the code again and like have a pet project or like participate in the hackathon and not sleep for 3 days? Or what does that look like as you're maturing as an engineer? Because I know that can be tough.
Oh yeah, very tough, and I think you just kind of have to accept it. I get asked all the time, like, oh, what is it like being like in leadership? And you're like, it's 20% tech, you know, like and then 80% is really just all the other stuff that is part of the role. So yeah, I think you also have to love that 80%, right? Like I think I see a lot of leaders struggle in these technical positions where they still really wanted to code 100% of the time, and that just doesn't work because it's not the nature of the role. And you have to kind of light that fire in somewhere else. So for me, like having discussions with the engineers and doing tech reviews and RFC discussions and like being really involved at just like at the architecture level, like that still does it for me. So it's really, you just gotta find what it is that you can still be really passionate about.
I like that. You're trying to like self-motivate a bit. Now that sounds like a tip from a book I've read, but do you have any resources or blogs that kind of helped you along those ways? Because I remember like sort of struggling with that. I'm just frustrated, like, oh, this is no fun. How do I get the joy back out of this job? What would your tip for that be, or do you have any resources that could help out?
I'm a huge fan of Simon Sinek.
Okay.
Yeah, so Finding Your Why. Yeah, so yeah, just reading a motivational book like that once in a while just to like remind you of like, yeah, what it is that you're doing, and it doesn't really apply to just leadership, but to everyone really, yeah.
Definitely. It came as a shock to me that there are some good business books.
I know, right?
I don't know if Benjamin or James, you've got others that sort of helped you out, but the Toyota Way, I feel like is one of those ones that people haven't necessarily read, but it's quite good.
Every context. It applies in every context.
As someone who's still in the individual contributor track, at Samsung, principal is the terminal level role. And the book that I just bought.
Such a nice ring to it, right? The terminal level role. Pause on that for
this is the end of the line.
I've reached my ultimate conclusion.
But the book that I buy for new principals at Samsung, and the book that I recommend to everyone who wants to advance their career in engineering, is the staff engineering book.
That's a good one, yeah.
I think it's an excellent resource, and I think it paints the picture that there's a lot more being a holistic software engineer at the top of your field versus just writing code all day. If you just want to write code all day and be at the top of your field, I invite you to the open source community. If you want to deliver meaningful business outcomes at the top of your field in software engineering, it often is the 80%.
I don't think that you have to give up writing code. One thing that I've embraced is finding projects outside the critical path for my teams and at least sketching them out myself, getting them to a point where I understand the technology and the problem, and then I can recruit some other engineers to like finish it, drag it over the line. Nobody likes it when I do that to them, but it happens. But I've also embraced throwaway projects, because as we scale in our individual careers, it's important to, I think, and I still have time for this, it's important to stay close to the metal, or as close as we can. And over the past couple of months, or I guess 9 months, I've really embraced projects that I start to throw away. You know, I'm not committed to getting anything done on this. I'm building it because I'm curious about how it works. And of course I'll write tests because I can't even think without writing tests, but like, it's not going to prod in this shape or at all. And it gives me the emotional flexibility to experiment with different technologies, different strategies, different structuring.
Gotcha. And I think one of those hot topic items that these days is perhaps having AI help you with a little bit of your code or something like that. And the reason I bring this up is because I think we've all mentioned tests. And when I talk to people, generally, let's say to be nice, let's say that the AI-generated code is maybe not that great. What I have seen, though, is that the testing can be pretty handy to at least get you started. Is that something that your organizations have started using or like evaluating or holding back on? I'm seeing a lot of nodding, okay.
Oh, yeah.
So in what aspect does that become involved in your jobs day to day?
Yeah, we've been using Copilot, so
Okay.
yeah, a big fan of that, and I know the teams are really excited about it. And yeah, I've heard that it has been increasing productivity on the teams, especially with testing and scaffolding and that kind of stuff.
Right. So that boilerplate kind of stuff,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah. So yeah, everyone I've talked to is a huge fan, so we're definitely using it.
That's really cool. What about yourself, James?
Samsung has implemented some restrictions on the use of generative AI.
Which also makes sense, I think.
Yes, absolutely. But we have done some experimentation with things like Copilot. Generally, we found some use for it, although our language set with Java has not necessarily been as invested in.
Right.
Although on the Rust side, like you said, testing has been fairly productive.
That's really cool.
OpenAI recently, in the last 6 months, changed their API licensing so that you can trust them with your data. They don't retain it for retraining.
Right. It
anymore.
seems to be depending on license or what
Yeah.
have you,
So
right?
that has unblocked us at least for using it, and I've seen individual engineers pick up entire new contexts just like that with it. But it's a tool, and like that's one of the things that I got to spend a fair amount of time playing around with and figuring out. And the coaching that I gave my team on this is, it's a car. You still need to drive it, right? Ask it for small, constrained things. And get that in. And, riff with it, rubber duck with it. At a certain point, like, what does ChatGPT think? Became a joke on our team because it's like, well, yes, I could answer this question for you about like this weird typing thing in TypeScript, or have you considered just dumping some representative snippets into ChatGPT and asking it?
See what happens kind of thing. I like that sort of rubber ducky technique in terms of ChatGPT. I've actually found a lot of use out of that brainstorming. But the other is trying to convince it to be your VP or SVP or EVP can be a little bit harder. How do you approach those hard conversations with leadership when you want to make sure that you're aligning with the business on what's important? What does that look like? Because I don't think that's harder to tell ChatGPT. Like, imagine you're a VP at Samsung.
Right. I think most of the time it's trying to talk about where is the industry going? Where do we need to invest now for the future?
Okay.
And what skill sets as an organization do we need to be familiar with in order to stay competitive into the future? Right. Samsung has been around for a long time, and oftentimes they are the manufacturer of the world that we live in.
Right.
As technology increases the rate of change in the world, Samsung continues to adapt to that change by learning what are the change agents. And so when I enter conversations, I also lead our AI project group as well. And so when I enter those conversations, a little bit of it's demystifying. It's definitely not Skynet. It can barely do math. Right. But if we don't learn this tool, if we look at our competitors and we look at industry and we look at consumer sentiment, we will be left behind. And so it might be constrained, it might be limited. We might do some limited POCs, but we're going to make sure that we at least have enough briefing material to when we do need to make a business critical decision, we can do that. And generally within those constraints, executives feel much more safe making a decision because it's not, all right, let's invest 12 months putting AI in the core product and hopefully it works.
Fair enough. Is that something that you're looking at Unbounce in terms of like things that you can maybe add into the product as well, so for people to consume as opposed to you using for people to consume?
Oh yeah, we've actually been ahead of the game in generative AI. Yeah, we have a AI-driven landing page builder that's been out in the market for 2.5 years.
Okay.
So
I ask this because it sounds like one of those big projects. I like sort of the topic we're talking about. There's a sea change happening. The business has maybe read something on the in-flight newsletter. They're like, AI is a thing. We should try this again.
I know. It's kind of funny because like we've been early into the market in it, and we were like convincing people like, you should use this. Like we have AI copy generation for landing pages. So you literally just put in your prompt and it generates a landing page for you. And the adoption wasn't, like people were scared of it. Like, oh, what is this AI thing? And then OpenAI, blew up 6 months ago and everyone was like.
You're prepped for it.
yeah. And everyone was suddenly like, oh, this is cool. Like, we've had this out for 2 years, So it's been kind of really interesting to see that shift and the huge adoption of these tools. Like they're not new; they've been around.
That's really cool. Yeah, so
Yeah.
this is one of those cases where you're sort of forward-looking and you're trying to convince people that it is the future. Luckily, you succeeded and you kind of landed well when it became popular. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
And what about on your side, Benjamin? Is this something that you're trying to offer to people, or is this something that maybe you're just using in-house to help with your offering?
We definitely use it in-house to help with our offering. We are cautiously considering its use in some applications for guest-facing features. We've evaluated it for customer support, and it's not really a good fit for us.
Fair enough.
It might be a good fit for other people, but it's just not a particularly good fit.
Yeah, it seems to depend on
us.
the data set as well.
Yeah.
I've heard a lot about like recommendation engines and generative AI, which seems like a mismatch, but somehow works, which is interesting to me.
You know, it's interesting. We're thinking about taking some like broad data about our parks and what's going on and trying to use that to, not necessarily in a conversational style, but to generate an itinerary perhaps. But it's challenging, and you are kind of at the whims of the operators. It's like you don't have control over the RNG.
Right.
Getting it deterministic is impossible if you're using someone else's thing.
Right.
If you want to start wrapping it in like safety controls, then you're adding latency, and it's not obviously a huge win. And
Fair enough.
there are big risks in there. And we are, for better or worse, a very reputation-sensitive company.
Of course, of course. And I sort of like that approach that you're talking about there. So it's, let's say they came from above. So somebody in a VP role, director role, or something says, hey, AI should be awesome.
Build me an AI
exactly.
thing, right?
But I like when you're talking about like our actual goals are this, and
It's
it
the
doesn't
same-
necessarily accomplish it.
It's the same process as like working with individual engineers or small teams of engineers to articulate a problem. You don't tell them anything. Nobody listens when you give them the solution.
Right.
Nobody appreciates anything that they get for free. So you ask questions, like you help them frame the problem. Never tell anyone anything. He says telling people things.
And how do you deal with it if there's pushback, where people are pushing you to say, hey, we need to radically change the product, or we need to incorporate this new technology?
Usually that comes from people with attention spans that are so short you can just slow roll them.
So she's like, slow down and eventually it'll go away, kind of thing?
No, it sounds expensive. Who are we going to do? What features are we going to delay? Like, I mean, we can do it if you want to do it, but like.
And I think sort of looping back to our first subject of conversation,
Cynical.
It's inviting them to be the solid business owner that they expect us to be, and saying, you know, hey, when I decided to come to you and talk about the fact that we need to shave 20 milliseconds off our authorization call, and I gave you all this evidence in order to do the investment, I'd appreciate you to do the same, because it helps me understand the problem and how to solve it. And that generally, other than those of short attention span, generally invites them to build a problem that isn't do the AI thing, but do this very specific feature using machine learning techniques built off of this data, which is a much better place to be as an engineer.
That's awesome.
It also helps to push the culture of docs back up.
Correct.
Like getting execs to buy in on culture of docs is powerful.
That's really cool. I think we're at the question period now, so if anyone's got any questions for us, we're done. We're done. Sorry, we ran out of time.
Oh,
for
we went
questions.
over. Okay.
We went over. All right. Well, thank you very much, folks. That was amazing. Have a great day. Thank you, folks.
Thank you.